want to welcome you to the New Breed Training Adaptive Leadership Summit. My name is Peyton Jones. I'm one of the trainers here at New Breed, also an author, wrote Church Plantology and some other books, which you're not here for, so we're not really going to talk about that. You're here because you want to know about adaptive leadership. Everybody knows that we are in a fast-paced society. America has always been faster. I've lived in Europe. We change on a dime. We don't have, thousands of years of tradition in Western American culture. The indigenous people did, but our society that's here in America today, we like change, but change has happened maybe a little too fast for a church that is rooted in tradition and has things that don't just change on a dime. I mean, we have a faith that is received, it's been given to us. And so my understanding of where a lot of leaders are at today is kind of like where the millennial generation was after the housing boom, 9/11, and then the housing crash. And that was disoriented and not so sure what they thought anymore about reality. We had the tiny homes generation. We had people choosing non-traditional careers after that, a huge rise in entrepreneurship because people kind of figured, hey, after the Twin Towers fell and, I was traumatized as a kid. Then a few years later, my parents lost their job, lost their homes, and lost their marriage. And they began to question everything and wonder, is it all worth it? And I think leaders are at that place today as really COVID, I would say, has really shocked. And then all the political stuff that's been going on. I mean, the foundations have really been shaken throughout Western culture and throughout the world of late. And I think ministers are starting to see maybe conferences and summits like this one, and they're starting to think, I don't even know if you can help me anymore. I mean, you're not bigger than COVID. You're not bigger than lockdowns and what they're going to do to my church. I don't think you have what I need. And so in coming up with this summit, we had to stop and think, what does it mean to be adaptive? Because I think that's what everybody wants. The problem with where we're at is that we have very often embraced methods and models. We go to a conference expecting someone to give us methodology. Well, methodology is transient. It changes quick. It burns out. It gets old and stale like yesterday's newspaper. Methods and models, borrowed models. I hear what Brian Sanders does, who's a guest tomorrow. He's awesome. But maybe that's not going to work in my context. And so I go and I beat my head up against the wall trying to do what Brian did. But it's methods and models. So what we're talking about is principles. We always want to train. Here comes a train, by the way, in the background. It's about to honk in our faces digitally. But we're looking at principles. What are the principles? And one of the principles that we see in the scripture is that ability to adapt to culture, right? We got to remember that Acts and Paul and the apostles eventually, they were all missionaries, cross-cultural missionaries. This whole thing was made to adapt to every culture so that it could reach every tongue, tribe, and nation. And with that, as we talk, I want to hand off because the number one thing that probably needs to adapt is us, right? We can try to adapt our churches. We can try to adapt everything else. But if you haven't adapted your own soul, your own heart, your own psyche, you're starting off with the cart before the horse. So our guest today is Rich Villodas, and I just want to introduce you here, Rich. He is Brooklyn born. He's the lead pastor of New Life Fellowship, a large multiracial church in Queens, Elmhurst, Queens. He's also a key speaker for Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. That is a movement with Pete Scazzaro that has touched hundreds of thousands of people. Rich, he has a BA in Pastoral Ministry and Theology from Nyack College. He has an MDiv from Alliance Theological Seminary, and he has written an award-winning book, The Deeply Formed Life, that dropped, ironically, during COVID in 2020. He and his wife, Rosie, have two beautiful children, and they reside in Queens. Don't let that fancy paneled background behind him fool you. Rich, man, it's so good to have you on here. You're going to talk to us about emotional health, adapting to that. So I just want to thank you for coming on and introduce you. And brother, the floor is yours.
Payne, thank you so much for the kind invitation and for the warm introduction. And yeah, I mean, you have set the stage really wonderfully in terms of the change that folks are experiencing and the impact that it's having on our lives. And to that end, what I want to do is take about 20 minutes to explore some ideas as it relates to, in light of this change, how do we live as a calm presence in the world? How do we live beyond reactivity? How do we resist reactivity and live as a calm presence? Which I think is perhaps one of the greatest gifts that we can offer the people that we lead, the people we're in relationship with. What does it mean to be a calm presence in a world that's rapidly changing and a world that's rapidly being shaped by reactivity? And so let me just set my timer here so I'm all good here, and then we'll have maybe some time for Q&A, which I think will be time well spent. When I think about reactivity, I think about, and the world that we live in, the convergence of powers that we're experiencing right now is a big reason for it. I've been trying to create an acronym to help us understand the present moment that we're in. And I've been using the language of CPR, that we live in a CPR world, and a world in which our breathing is impacted, a world in which it's hard to, hearts are ailing. And by CPR, what I'm getting at is the convergence of three things: the convergence of COVID-19, the convergence of political idolatry, the convergence of racial hostility. We have these three very large powers that in the last couple of years have converged to create all kinds of seismic changes in our society, in our churches, in our souls. And this is not including just the regular day-to-day stuff that we have to deal with that often causes lots of stress, lots of pain, lots of reactivity in our souls. We're in a CPR world, lots of change. And so in light of this reality, in which it's very easy to live according to reactivity, how do we cultivate calm presence in a world of great anxiety? And when I think about that, I think about a few people that I have the privilege of shepherding at our church at New Life. In 2020, a month before the election, I remember getting an email from one of our pastors, and I did what I'm sure most of you don't do. The email was sent late at night, and I opened my email around 11 p.m. And I thought to myself, should I wait till the morning to read this, or should I read it right now? And the right answer is usually wait till the morning if you don't want to mess up your sleep. But at 11 p.m., I opened up the email, and one of our pastors has sent an email saying, Rich, we're a month away from the election. I have a great idea. What if we had two of our congregants who one's voting for Trump, one's voting for Biden? Can we have them in conversation with each other in front of the entire church on Zoom? And that was the ask. And so with great confidence and great faith, I responded and said, we're never going to do that. Are you crazy? What kind of church do you think this is? She said, I thought we were the emotionally healthy church. And my response was, that's when Pete was leading it. We're in a new day. And so she came back with I think we should do this. What if we got two elders to be the two people? And I thought, this is even worse. We should not do this whatsoever. And so some more conversation took place, and we decided together to have this forum. And I never forgot when we were about to have it. That morning, went to church. It was on a Sunday, got home to my bedroom, which was my office at that time in 2020. And I opened up the laptop and I thought to myself, this is going to be awful. Bad things are going to happen in the chat section. This is going to be terrible. And I did what most pastors do. They opened up the Zoom, press start video, and I said, praise the Lord, everyone. This is going to be fantastic. I feel the Lord's presence already. This is going to be great. I lied, basically. And we had the conversation. And in our context, it was a Korean American man in his 50s who was voting for Trump, and a Puerto Rican man in his 60s who was voting for Biden, and an African American millennial young man who was moderating the conversation. That's how we do it in Queens here. And what I saw was very surprising. What I saw was matters that are very polarizing, matters and issues that have divided families and churches. And yet, what I saw on that day was curiosity. What I saw on that day was calm presence. And what were there moments of awkwardness? Yes. Were there a moment of sharp disagreement? Yes. But more than anything, what I saw that day was calm presence. And I think that's what the Lord is inviting us into as leaders, as pastors, as church planters. What does it mean to live a life of calm presence in a world that's dominated by anxiety? And so with that, I want to just share a couple of slides here to anchor my thoughts here on really what I'm getting at here. One of the big problems before us is that we live in a reactive world. And you could argue, and I'll come back to this in a moment, that this is at the core of what anxiety is about. We live in a very anxious society, and anxiety is not, I think we often understand anxiety to mean excessive worry. And I think anxiety is much more than just excessive worry. Anxiety is this automatic response. It's this reactivity. Sometimes it's positive. If there's a bear chasing me in the woods, this is no time to give thought to my ways. This is time to run. That's good anxiety. But it's automatic response that emerges out of interior or exterior anxiety. This is reactivity. And we live in a society that's marked by great anxiety and reactivity. And the invitation for us as leaders, as pastors, as church planters, as parents, as friends, is to cultivate a life of self-differentiation, which is what I really want to emphasize today, that word, self-differentiation. Differentiation in an anxious culture. And I think this is one of the most important emotional health aspects of leadership that we are called to cultivate. Now, by differentiation, this is what I mean by it. This is kind of a classic definition of it. It comes out of family systems theory, where differentiation is this process of becoming an I while remaining close to others, especially in times of high anxiety. Remaining an I while remaining close to others, especially in times of high anxiety. My personal definition of it is remaining close and curious to God, close and curious to myself, while remaining close and curious to others, especially in times of high anxiety, and resisting the polar opposite pull of two things, of either cutting people off or enmeshing into them. And I think these are the two realities that we are often faced with, particularly in times of high anxiety, to cut people off or to disappear into them. And the question is, how do I remain close to God, close to myself, and close to others in times of high anxiety without cutting people off? And so what we're getting at here at the core of it is the two extremes that often dominate our lives are emotional fusion and cutoffs. And so a person on a low end of differentiation that does not remain close to God, to ourselves, and to others often disappears into someone, into a relationship, into an opinion. They can't take a stand on a particular issue, or they depart. They just don't have the capacity to remain in any kind of relationship. And these are two, sadly, realities that has marked our churches, that people fuse into each other or they cut off, and has marked our leadership, that we fuse or we cut off from each other. Another way of understanding differentiation, my predecessor, I like Pete's way of saying it, is remaining connected to people and yet not having your reaction or behavior determined by them. Remaining connected to people, that's really important. Remaining and not having your reaction or your behavior determined by them. And so the competing pulls that we have as leaders and the challenge of growing in differentiation is this competing pull to be over responsible for others' reactions or to be emotionally apathetic to others. And to live a life of health, emotional health, spiritual health requires us to grow in this aspect of differentiation. And so at its core, what we must learn to do is learn how to healthily separate ourselves from others so as to healthily attach to them. A lot of people separate and they never learn to attach, or they attach in such a way that it becomes enmeshment, and you cannot distinguish one person from the next. And these are both two ends of unhealthy spectrums. Now, differentiation in the Bible, when I think about differentiation in the Bible, there are a number of people I think about. I think of number one of Jesus. Jesus had lots of pressures around him, the crowds, the Pharisees, the disciples, and they try to conform him to their agenda, conform him to their will. And what we see in Jesus throughout the scriptures is this remarkable ability to remain connected to people in love, and at the same time proclaim something that often radically challenged the people around them, something called the kingdom of God. And in Jesus Christ, we find him walking that tightrope of remaining connected, yet not having his actions or reactions determined by other people. I think about David and Saul. One of the classic definitions or examples of differentiation is when David and Goliath story in 1 Samuel. And here we have Goliath insulting the nation of Israel, insulting Saul, and David comes on the scene. And what we find is this remarkable moment of differentiation where Saul says, if you're going to fight him, you have to wear my armor. And David tries on Saul's armor, remains close to Saul in that moment. But David is too aware of himself and his own strengths that he has to make a hard decision to the king in front of other people to take off the armor and go in the ways that the Lord has called him to go. But I want you to see that he remains close to Saul, yet at the same time, David is able to establish a particular boundary and saying, no, this is who God has called me to be. God has not called me to wear your armor. God has called me to fight in a particular way. We find differentiation in the Bible in a negative way with Aaron and the people of God, that Moses is away, he gets lost in the mountain, what have you, and they are wanting, we need a God to worship. And Aaron now is enmeshed into the people. He's now violating what the Lord has called him to. And now because he's on the low spectrum of differentiation, he does exactly what the people want. When you look at Paul's letters are documented differentiation, if you're going to use that language, where he remains closely connected emotionally to these people, yet at the same time speaks truth in ways that often disrupted and was hard to hear. And so again, differentiation is about how do we remain close to God, close to ourselves, and close to others in times of high anxiety, and resisting the polar opposite pull of cutting people off or being enmeshed into them. And so to really get at this and locate ourselves, a good question for our reflection is, where do we typically go when anxiety surfaces? Do we tend to cut people off, or do we tend to fuse into them? And why? I think much of the leadership challenges that we experience, much of the leadership pain that we transmit, often happens because we have not taken this question seriously, have not examined this question seriously enough. Why do I cut people off? Why do I fuse into them? And I think this is an important question for our emotional health and for the emotional health of the system that we are trying to cultivate, called the church. And so I know what some of the answers might be. For some of you, the answer might be, it depends where I'm at. At work, I might cut off, but at home, I might fuse, with your parents, with close friends, with a partner. A question for the sake of our health personally and organizationally and with our communities is, where do we typically go? So that's just a question for our own reflection. I would also say that to talk about differentiation, back to this idea of anxiety, is to wrestle with our own anxiety. And again, anxiety is not simply excessive worry. Anxiety is our automatic response to a real or a perceived threat. And so I meet pastors from time to time, or people from time to time, who say, you know what, I'm not an anxious person. And what they understand anxiety is excessive worry. But you can be anxious without having excessive worry. You can be anxious and your anxiety manifests by control, manipulation, anger, avoidance. It can manifest in so many different ways, but anxiety is a core force that we have to reckon with. And really, there's two kinds of anxieties, and the anxiety called acute anxiety and chronic anxiety. Acute anxiety is situational; it's time-based. Chronic anxiety is something that is enduring. Another way of thinking about this I like to mention to give categories is there's situational anxiety that's momentary, and then there is soul anxiety that we just carry on a regular basis. And soul anxiety happens in a myriad of ways. It happens when someone says, hey, can we meet? I just want to discuss some things. And you go to all kinds of negative conclusions and assumptions about where this person might want to go and the conversations they might want to have. And it emerges because you're carrying some deep soul anxiety in you. But unless we're able to navigate using some of this language, we're going to have a hard time again going down the path of differentiation, which I contend is one of the most important tasks for leaders, particularly in this moment. I want to skip this thing here, but I think for our own reflection, here are a couple of questions that really I think we would do well to spend time with. And then I'm going to give a case study, a personal case study, and then I'll be done with my time. We'll take some questions. Before reflection, I think we cannot, I don't know if we can get 30 minutes of better time by exploring what current anxiety you're holding right now. What's the anxiety that's causing a sense, not just of, again, of concern or worry, but you find yourself automatically responding, automatically reactive to something. Who makes you most anxious? As a leader, the person who has made me most anxious as a pastor in our local context has been the board chair. The chair of our board of elders has been the person, and I realized that it wasn't one person. I realized that it was what that position represented, because in my tenure as pastor at New Life, I've had 3 board chairs. We have different term limits. And I realized that by the second board chair, my issue was not with the first board chair per se. It was with the person who was in this role. And so who makes you most anxious? And then what situations produce the most anxiety in you? I think these are the 3 really helpful questions. Now, let me just, at New Life, one of the most important questions that we ask as leaders is, what does my reaction tell me about myself? And to grow in differentiation and to move beyond anxiety, where it doesn't now limit us, requires us to ask this question: what does my reaction tell me about myself? And it is here where I want to just give a little case study as it relates to my own life with God, and some of the ways that I've had to navigate through the pressures of this CPR world, and in a context that has brought up lots of stress as a pastor. I pastor a very diverse congregation. 75 nations are represented in our church, in what National Geographic called the most diverse zip code in the world, where I pastor. And we just don't have ethnic and racial diversity. We have political diversity, generational diversity, socioeconomic diversity. It's a beautiful church, but because of our diversity, there are lots of opportunities for misunderstanding, lots of opportunities for pain, lots of opportunity for disagreement. And I remember experiencing lots of anxiety, not during 2020, but after January 6th, what happened at the Capitol. And what happened was January 6th happened, and it was on a Wednesday. I had a sermon that was planned. And by Thursday, I realized I think I need to adjust my sermon to speak to this particular national issue for our own context as a church. which just made me think, sometimes I wish the Lord would make all the madness happen on Mondays. I wish all the madness can happen on Mondays so that I would have enough time to work on my sermon as opposed to adjusting on Thursday or Friday. And so I adjusted my sermon. And the week after January 6th on the church calendar was a focus on the baptism of Jesus. And so I preached a sermon on baptism. What does it mean to belong to Jesus Christ? What does it mean that our allegiance is to Jesus Christ? And so I talked about things like, to have our allegiance to Jesus means we must resist the way of cable news discipleship and resist the ways of conspiracy theories and these crazy charismatic prophecies and corrosive racism. And, it was a wonderful sermon with alliteration across the board. It was great. And after preaching a sermon, which a lot of people did not like, I would say, 30% of our congregation probably voted for Trump, 30% voted for Biden, 20% abstained, another 10% voted for Spider-Man because he's from Queens. We're all over the map. And so a few weeks after my sermon, I started getting a lot of Zoom invitations to have conversation with congregants because they didn't like what I was saying. And whether I said it the right way or not, that's not the point here. The point is my reaction to these invitations. And people were asking for 2-hour meetings. And I'm thinking, I don't know if anything good can come out of a 2-hour Zoom meeting. But I met with a number of people. And I remember this one person who was a pillar of our church who wanted to meet. And this person said, Rich, can we meet and just have lots of questions? And up into that meeting, I started feeling deep anxiety, concern, worry. And anxiety for me, whenever anxiety hits, I often have a hard time catching a satisfying breath. And it reminds me, at New Life, we like to say that the body is a major prophet, not a minor prophet. That the body often knows ahead of time what's happening before our minds can catch up. And so I was recognizing in my body, I'm not catching a satisfying breath. I'm not sleeping well. And I had this meeting with this pillar of our congregation. And two hours before the meeting, I thought, I need to get to God because I don't want to go into this meeting flooded in this way. And so I went to God, asking the Lord to reveal the messages, the deep messages within me. What's happening inside of me that's keeping me living according to anxiety and reactivity and not presence, not calm presence. And I remember sitting down on this bench on Queens Boulevard, asking the Holy Spirit to reveal to me what's happening in me. And I sat down with my journal, and really I was listening for these messages, and this is what came to the surface in my own soul. These messages that were in my soul were, when people disagree with me, it means I'm a bad leader. The message that said, if congregants and I are not on the same page, I'm doing something wrong as a leader. That I'm causing division by bringing up delicate issues. That things will end in the worst way possible, and it will be my fault. That I need you to like me for me to be okay. And I need you to agree with me for me to be okay. And that people who leave New Life expose my deficiencies in leadership. Now, when these things came to the surface, it became clear that so much of this, maybe all of it, is rooted in lies. And as I sat with that, the faulty thinking, the bad messages, the ways that anxiety was creeping in me so that I could not be a calm presence, something happened inside that shifted. I began to get different perspective. And I prayed on that bench on Queens Boulevard, went into that meeting, wasn't fully calm, but I think something in my soul was acknowledged. And it helped me to be more present to that person and to other people after that day than I had the capacity to do before that. And I think we all have those messages, those stories, those lies that live inside of us when anxiety surfaces. And one of the most important things we can give ourselves to is to attending to those messages so that we can be a calm presence, remaining close to God, close to ourselves, and close to others especially in times of high anxiety. And so, with that said, I know that's a lot in 23 minutes or so, um, but I wanted to spend the rest of our time uh, in any Q&A. And so I think we might have maybe 15, 20 minutes. Brooks, you correct me if I'm wrong of how much time we have here. But if there's any questions in the chat section or any other questions that someone, I'm not sure if folks can unmute themselves and share, but I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have about anything I've said or anything maybe that I didn't say. And so, Brooks, any direction from you, or if anyone can unmute themselves?
Thanks, Rich. Thanks for sharing all that. And guys, if you have any questions for Rich, you can put those in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those. Rich, I'd love to hear a little bit about, I know this isn't the Deeply Formed Life webinar or anything, but I would love to hear about, you give us 5 transformational values in those.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit about, why you picked those particular 5 values, what they have to do with helping us with anxiety and things like that.
Yeah, the 5 values, for those who might be unaware, are contemplative rhythms, racial reconciliation, interior examination, sexual wholeness, and missional presence. And the reason I selected those 5 was quite simply, those 5 values have been the values of our congregation for a number of years. And so we use different language internally within our congregation. So I use that language to make it a little bit more accessible to those outside of our context. But in many ways, the contemplative aspect of it, contemplative rhythms, and the interior examination aspect are really to be held together and serve as, in many ways, the foundation to engage some of the larger issues of society, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about sexuality, whether we're talking about justice, because those issues are often not approached with calm presence. Those issues are often so volatile and so based on reactivity. And so I wrote the values, I wrote that book not simply so that we can get a handle on anxiety. I think there's a lot to that, but so that we can have a comprehensive approach to what discipleship might look like, particularly when we're thinking about very delicate and polarizing issues in our day.
Yeah, that's great. And so I'm also interested to know, how do you handle any pushback with some of the, like, I hear a lot of people talk about soul care and emotional health, and I don't hear a lot of people talking about racial reconciliation as part of that.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wrote this book was because I wanted to offer an ambitious reframing of spiritual formation for this generation and emerging generations. And so I'm aware that to talk about racial reconciliation is not something that's typically within the spiritual formation category. But I begin with a theological conviction that racial justice and reconciliation is a core gospel issue. At the core of the gospel is the creation of a new family across all kinds of barriers. This is Ephesians 2. This is Galatians 3. This is, this is all throughout the New Testament, and really a fulfillment of the entire story of the scriptures. And so, racial justice and reconciliation isn't this optional thing that we should give ourselves to. It's core to what it means to be followers of Jesus. And so, if that's my theological starting point, then my next question is, how can I connect that theological value with a life, a formation that helps me live into that? And so that's very simply the reason I wrote it, because I see racial justice as a core theological and formational matter, not something for every context that we find ourselves in, monocultural, very diverse. I think it's for everyone, and it looks different in different contexts. But this is a core gospel issue that we must give our attention to.
Yeah. And it looks like we've got a question from Joel. He says he likes your question. What does my reaction say about me? And I think his question, how do you maintain a healthy ongoing response to your anxiety regardless of situations?
Yeah, I think a healthy response to our anxiety is that level of curiosity that we give ourselves to. There are various issues that are going to cause varying degrees of anxiety. But I think if we're living asking ourselves that question, I think that in itself is a healthy response. If we're taking the time to go, why am I so triggered by that? Or why did I respond? Why was my immediate reaction anger, or my immediate reaction to pull away from that person, to avoid that person, my immediate reaction to want to fight in that space there? If we're not asking those questions, we're missing out on significant fodder for revelation that God wants to give us about ourselves. And so I think in just asking ourselves that question, and when we connect it to a particular situation, I think that's a very healthy response. And then we can ask ourselves, okay, in light of what I'm learning about myself and why I responded that way, what might be now the best response, the best way to engage this person or not engage this person? But I think asking that question in and of itself is a very healthy response to the anxiety that often is happening on a subterranean level.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we've got another question coming from Felix in Cameroon. Thanks for sending your question, Felix. What keeps the leader stable in the midst of anxiety? I think is the.
Yeah, I think I understand what Felix is saying. Maybe I would reword it this way, man. I hope this is what he's getting at. What does stability look like? How can I maintain a stable presence in the midst of anxiety? One of the things that I think about is the idea of what some people call self-regulation. And self-regulation is, it's the way to gain some form of equilibrium, balance, stability in our own mind and our own hearts, which sometimes emerges out of taking time to breathe. I love on my watch that I'm reminded a few times a day to breathe. And sometimes when I get those reminders, I realize it doesn't feel like I've taken a breath today. And when we're able to just breathe, I think there's something that happens within us for the sake of stability. Along those lines, I had something in the PowerPoint that I didn't get into of, what does this mean to grow in differentiation, to maintain a greater sense of stability in times of anxiety. And I would say a few things like this here, like emotional regulation it's capturing and praying through differentiation moments. I think one of the best things we can give ourselves as leaders is when we find ourselves cutting off from people, when we find ourselves disappearing into people, like we're not stating what we believe about something, we're not stating our preferences, we're not clear for leaders about vision or whatever it might be. Why? These are differentiation moments. And I think capturing it, we'd be able to do that. Breathing exercises, prayer, naming the messages. That's what I was doing, and naming the messages before I was heading into that meeting that was causing great anxiety. Speaking clearly, space to process with others. I meet with 3 pastor friends the first Wednesday of each month for an hour and a half. And these are moments to process often the stress that I'm feeling, the anxiety that I'm carrying. And then lastly, I put here connecting anxiety to family of origin. I don't have time to go into that, but so much of our anxiety comes because of the messages that have come long before the moment it came, messages from our childhood that we have not yet processed. And so those are a few ideas, I think, that can help us grow into a stable presence in the midst of anxiety.
Yeah, that's great. And so, and the primary focus of our webinar is working on yourself, your own soul care, managing your own anxiety. But what are some ways, once you're starting to walk that way healthily, what are some ways that you can help lead your staff or core team, and then maybe your congregation as well? We have a lot of church leaders on here that will be kind of senior pastor or church planters.
Yeah, um, I think two things come to mind. The first is, if you want to create a culture in which this becomes the norm, where people are working through their anxiety, they're not living according to reactivity, I think number one, they need a model. They need someone who's going to show them the way. And so if you're a leader, one of the ways that we model it is by storytelling, and vulnerability. Me sharing whenever I share a moment with our team, whenever I share a moment with our church, when anxiety has surfaced, when I was living according to reactivity, what I'm doing there is I am showing them, number one, that these things can be spoken of, that if the pastor is mentioning it, that this should be a safe space for anyone to come out with this. But also, there's a sense of freedom that I'm giving them by being vulnerable in that space. But beyond just my vulnerability, I think what people need are, they need very clear guidance. And so there's a couple of questions. We use a tool at New Life called, or practice, exploring the iceberg, and it's helping people to identify 4 questions that we often don't give enough time to. What am I angry about? What am I mad about? What am I sad about? What am I anxious about? What am I glad about? And I've led that with our staff and leadership and our church as a whole in so many different contexts, because what it does is it gives them not just a model, oh, I see someone doing it, but it gives the tools to actually begin to do this myself. And so I think people need models and they need tools. But the modeling part and the vulnerability part is probably the most important thing, because what it does there, it creates a particular climate that makes it, it makes it okay for folks to say, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I need help with.
That's great. And do you have any like cool stories that you'd be able to share of like, okay, now once somebody felt like, okay, now it's okay, that they experienced some freedom from that?
It sounds weird to say it, but whenever I meet with our staff, whenever I meet with our pastors, space is created for those moments. And so I feel like, we had a conversation today about where I asked 2 questions to our pastoral team just 2 hours ago. Where are we seeing ministry fruit that we want to continually to cultivate? And where are we seeing ministry stagnation that we need to either fine tune or go in a totally different direction altogether? And when we got to the ministry stagnation portion of it, to hear people identify the anxiety, the concern about being stuck in this area, and that being okay to hear, and then we can process together. I feel like those kinds of conversations are happening on a regular basis. And what it does is it number one, it reminds us that we're not alone in our stagnation and in our anxiety. And number two, as we name these things, I think we open ourselves up to creative process. We open ourselves up to discernment. We open ourselves up to what the Spirit might be wanting to say. And so as a leader, one of the greatest gifts we can give people is just space to speak out loud the anxieties, the puzzles, the stagnation that we feel. And I think as we do that, the Spirit has a way of working in beautiful ways as we begin out of that place of brokenness and weakness.
That's beautiful. And, we have a lot of people from all over the world here. We've got people on from Africa, Europe, South America, and of course, North America. And considering your church is one of the most diverse churches, do you have any advice for people that are in cross-cultural contexts, dealing with trying to lead people through anxiety. If there's any kind of cultural barriers that you have run into, any kind of pitfalls they could avoid.
Yeah, I think to some degree or another, I think sociologists might be able to clearly delineate one culture from the next and how one culture responds to trauma or one culture responds to anxiety, and the difference within those cultures, the nuances within those cultures. And I think all that is necessary and helpful across the board ministry wise. So having a sociological lens and a cultural lens, I think, is really important. I say that to also say what I've discovered as a pastor in a context as diverse as ours, and not just, again, ethnically and racially diverse, but truly culturally diverse. 50% of Queens is foreign born. And so we have lots of first generation, second generation folks. But what I've discovered is across the board, most people have a hard time giving expression to their anxiety. Most people have a hard time being vulnerable. Again, you could say some cultures more than others because, for example, in cultures that are marked by a shame honor culture, in which we honor family, we don't speak poorly of family, especially in public. There might be some cultures and dynamics that lend more towards that than others. But what I've discovered being a pastor here for 14 years is that to be human is to experience lots of resistance in being vulnerable. That this is somehow not just a cultural phenomenon, that this might be rooted in theology, rooted in what it means to be in a sinful world, a world that's marked by self-protection, a world that's marked by fig leaves, a world that's marked by wanting to show myself as competent. And so, yeah, I've discovered even in a cross-cultural context that this struggle is one of a human struggle, not simply a cultural or a geographical struggle or generational struggle for that matter.
Yeah, thank you. And Rich, we're almost out of time. So is there any other things that you would want to leave people with, any encouragement or anything?
Yeah, I think whenever someone asks me that question, I usually say the same thing. And so I'm pretty prepped for this here. And for me, it's not cliche. I do really believe that the greatest gift that we offer the people we lead is our ongoing transformation in Jesus. And as we are allowing ourselves to be formed by the Spirit, as we are opening ourselves up to be formed into the image of Jesus, as we are spending time to look within our own lives to identify what are the fears, the anxieties, the idols, the hopes, the dreams that live inside of me that the Lord wants to attend to and wants me to attend to the degree that I do those things is the degree to which I will, number one, live in wholeness and in freedom, but also be the kind of person that other people want to follow. And at the end of the day, as leaders, I do think when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, follow me as I follow Christ, I do think that is what leaders are to say as well. And that's frightening on one level because we see our own contradictions. But what if the contradictions inside of us were not to be an obstacle towards good leadership? What if they are the means to good leadership? That we recognize our own contradictions, but in so doing, we're bringing it to God. We're living lives of confession and repentance, but we're not seeing our contradictions as the things that exclude us from good ministry and good leadership. No, we're just aware of our contradictions. And I think as we give ourselves to the ongoing work of transformation in Jesus Christ, that ultimately is the best gift we give our people, not our sermons, not our vision casting ability, not our recruiting skills. All those things are so important and stuff that I give a lot of my time to. But the most important thing is who I'm becoming in Jesus Christ.
That's excellent. Rich, thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly a blessing to have you with us. And guys, if you're tuning in, you can get Rich's book, The Deeply Formed Life. I've got it right here. Highly recommend it. And Rich didn't pay me to say that. And he's got another book coming out, Good and Beautiful and Kind. And so you can pre-order that now. And then we will also we're going to take about a 5 to 10 minute break. And we will be back with Mindy Calaguire, who is the founder of soulcare.com. So you guys can take a break and we'll be back shortly. And thank you, Rich, for joining us.
Thank you so much.